Hey guys, this is Patrick from STH, and this laid out in front of me is an HPE ProLiant DL380T Gen10. And that T stands for Trusted Supply Chain. Now, a few months ago on the STH main site, we covered this new HPE Trusted Supply Chain offering. Specifically, what that offering is a set of services and servers that have a country of origin, USA. And the real goal there is to tackle some of the security in the supply chain issues that are kind of relevant today. As part of this offering, this server says it's made in the US. And while this server is made in the US and this early kind of program is really designed or offering is designed for the US market, HPE did tell us that they are planning to move it out to other jurisdictions. It's just this is kind of the first one that they have. And the basic idea that HPE is trying to tackle is how do you secure the supply chain from basically the server manufacturer's dock all the way to the customer installation. And that's really the problem that they're trying to solve with this offering. So after our discussion with HPE, they said, hey, do you want to go check out this whole offering thing? And we said, yes. They said, okay, cool, we'll send you a server. And the thought originally was that we were going to do our ProLiant DL380 Gen10, even though it's kind of late in the cycle. We're still going to do our review based on the system. When the system arrived, it had a single Intel Xeon Bronze 3204, which is the lowest end chip that you can have, and only had one, not two. We also had a single 8 gig DIMM, and then we had a 480 gig SATA SSD, and then we had, a single 10, 25 gig NIC. And we were looking at that and we didn't have all the risers, all the coolers, all that kind of stuff. And we just kind of said, well, you know what? It kind of doesn't make sense for us to review this system when a lot of the other systems that we review are much better configured. Just that wouldn't make sense. And since we didn't think it would be fair to do a review like that for HPE, what we decided to do instead was just tear this entire server down, see where the components are from. And so that gives us an idea of when we say country of origin USA, where the server components come from, because that's not really something that HPE talks a lot about. So game plan for this video is that we're going to start out and I want to talk a little bit about what the trusted supply chain offering is from HPE, because I think it's really important to really understand what HPE is trying to accomplish. And so I want to go through that first. Then we're going to tear down this server. Well, I mean, it's already torn down in front of me, but I'm going to go through a whole bunch of different, pictures and just kind of show you all the different components and all the made in or produced product of whatever they are stickers. We're going to go look at those. And then I also wanted to conclude with some final thoughts. Now, this is one that I am expecting that we're going to have a lot of comments on. Now, I'm just presenting, I just want to make sure that everybody understands what's going on. I'm just presenting what this offering is. I want to present, what we have in this particular configuration. I don't want to pass judgment. STH, we try to stay, not political, just show off the technology. And so I just want to go and show that. But I think that you guys are going to have a lot of comments, so it'll be interesting to read those. The first thing we wanted to do was really discuss this HPE Trusted Supply Chain offering. Now, this is something that major governments, major organizations like critical infrastructure, finance, those types of organizations are all thinking about these days. How do we secure the supply chain for the servers and equipment that go into our data centers? Frankly, this makes just complete sense. And the first time I heard it, I said, oh yeah, this definitely makes sense as a service offering. In 2018, there weren't a lot of people that thought about, okay, well, a server leaves a manufacturer's loading dock or shipping dock and then goes to a customer. And along that journey, it's touched by a number of different folks that have physical hands on the hardware. Then, maybe it's a third-party contractor that goes in and actually installs the servers into the racks if you're not buying, completely integrated rack or whatever. And so there are a whole bunch of different touches that happen along that path. And so you kind of just sit back and you say, well, there's a lot of opportunity for someone to go in and potentially tamper with hardware in that transit between the manufacturer and when it gets installed on the data center. These days, not only do we have this from HPE, but all the major cloud providers are looking at that physical security, and we're even seeing that go down to consumer devices. And this is exactly the challenge that the HPE Trusted Supply Chain offering is set to address. So let's talk about that Trusted Supply Chain offering. So what HPE is trying to do is, especially when you look at the big verticals or industries, you're really looking at government customers, financial customers, critical infrastructure, so power companies and stuff like that. Critical infrastructure companies, those are really the big verticals that I think HPE is really targeting first with an offering like this. HPE has a manufacturing facility in Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin, which if you're not from the US is kind of in the middle and north part of the US. And there, HPE has vetted personnel that can assemble the server. Now I can tell you a little bit about HPE's process because while I actually had an HP or HPE badge back in the day, man, that was probably like a decade ago or something like that now. And back then they used to do things like background checks and all kinds of stuff just to even just get a contractor badge, not even to go into a manufacturing facility. And so with this Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin facility with vetted personnel, it's able to take in the raw components and then create and transform those components into a finished server like this ProLiant DL380T Gen10. And by doing that transformation in Wisconsin, we get an Origin USA label. We should note just real quick that this is actually different than the Made in USA program. If you're outside the US, you probably may not have an idea of what this is, but there's basically, it was a kind of nationalistic manufacturing push many years ago. And so there's actually a kind of like marketing program-ish that is basically a Made in the USA program. And that is a kind of has a different set of requirements than just getting this Origin USA label. I know that we have folks that watch this from outside the US, so I'm trying to go and kind of give in a little bit of these cultural references and just points so that way you know what's going on. But key here is that all of the components do not need to be manufactured in the US to be able to get this Origin US or USA label. We looked it up on the Customs and Border Patrol website, and this is basically some of the language that's around what is required in one of the tests. We're not going to go into all the details here, but it seems that the substantial transformation really involves taking all the raw components and assembling them into a complete server, which kind of makes sense. And NIC is not a server, but that's also why we're going to do the teardown, just to go see what those components are. HPE has features like a server configuration lock where they can take a, kind of snapshot of the system as it's leaving the manufacturing facility, say, here are all the components that are supposed to be in there. And cryptographically, if that is changed and altered when you go power on the system on the other end and say, something got swapped out or something changed in the system, HPE can say, something happened. This is not the same as we left the factory from. And really the goal is just to make sure that the same configuration that leaves the factory is the same one that is booting in a customer data center. And leaving the manufacturing facility, you have to also just think about all the logistics involved to actually take a rack or many racks of servers, or even just a single server. And once you take it, it gets put on a truck, probably goes to some kind of hub, then goes through different types of, people that are handling the server, then finally ends up at the facility that it's getting installed in. Even if you're doing a point-to-point transfer, you still have a truck that's most likely taking the server and delivering it to a data center. So not only does HPE have its secure firmware base and things like the system configuration lock, but it can also have vetted folks to go and actually transport the servers all the way into the customer facilities. Now, HPE wouldn't give us an exact price in terms of differential between, a DL380 Gen10 versus a DL380T Gen10, but they basically told us like low single-digit percentage, and that kind of seems reasonable. One of the other thoughts that they had was that you'll have kind of like lower cybersecurity insurance premiums, and that will help offset some of the costs. And so it's just something to kind of look at. I think it is kind of reasonable price. If it was something like 2x, I don't necessarily think what HPE is offering here would maybe be worth that to many customers, but I think at a low double-digit percentage, I think it is probably worthwhile. And so overall, this whole trusted supply chain program, what you have to remember here is that these are servers that have a country of origin in the US because they're made in the US. In the future, they'll be elsewhere, but just for right now, it's the US. When they're assembled, HPE can validate the specs, lock the configuration down, have their secure firmware, and then handle any of the logistics that need to happen to be able to get those from the HPE manufacturing facility all the way to a customer site. The bottom line comes down to reducing the exposure of physical tampering in that supply chain. Now, I think it's time to get to that teardown, but before we do, you may be wondering about this awesome sweatshirt that we have. Well, if you are, you can get one on our Teespring shop. That is how we pay for making these videos. So I mentioned this earlier, but just as we go through this teardown, I just want to just note that this is a single configuration. HPE sent us this configuration, so we didn't get to pick it or anything like that. If you get a different configuration, you're likely to have different components from what we have here, and HPE can also change things over time. So we're just taking this snapshot and taking a look at it. And while we normally have a lot of B-roll, what I found out was that on the 4K camera, just kind of given distances and how small some of this text was, it made a lot more sense just to take photos of stuff. So that's what we're going to be looking at here. That's just kind of what it is. We need to do photos today. So first off, in the front of the chassis, we can see the HPE Trusted Supply Chain sticker. Now, again, if you're outside of the US and you just don't know this, Americans love to go put flags on absolutely everything. And since this is really designed for the US market, they put a flag on it. I'm pretty sure that when they bring it to other jurisdictions, it'll have different kinds of flags, but Americans love to see this flag, so if that doesn't seem like a big feature, you'd be surprised. Now on the model designator, we have a HPE ProLiant DL380T Gen10 with the T added, which is for our trusted supply chain. On top of the front of the system, we can actually see that there is a made in US, includes foreign content on the label, and that is what gives us the country of origin. This is actually a huge deal because country of origin, when you're doing some RFPs and bidding on contracts, having that country of origin can be a differentiator, especially when you're going and bidding like in things like government contracts and stuff. So it is a big deal. All right, so in the front of the chassis, our unit came with a 480 gig SATA SSD from SK Hynix. This drive hails from South Korea. Opening in the chassis, we thought that perhaps the sheet metal would be made in the US to increase the US part content, but it is labeled as being from China. We do like the fact that there is a printed service guide here, and we're going to continue to mention that until all vendors catch up to companies like HPE and make this a standard feature. Having the chassis intrusion detection switch installed as part of the program. After all, this is a way that you can detect if the chassis is being opened, and so that is something that you kind of need, is just that kind of physical sensor. We can see that the switch has a made in China label on it. Just before this, we actually did a Dell EMC PowerEdge R7525 review, and we mentioned that Dell's use of a 24-bay backplane was interesting since most companies are using this kind of 3 8-bay backplanes for a 24-drive system. And HPE actually shows us a really good example of that with a 3 8-bay backplane setup with one of those 8-bay backplanes installed in our test unit and 2 other bays that are open. That allows HPE to give you 8, 16, and 24-bay solutions. Both the label on the PCB backplane for our storage, as well as on the power cable here, state that those parts are from China. Likewise, the SFF data cables that go into that backplane are made in China as well. In that cable management area, we also have the front panel cable bundle, and this really has all the USB and like LED wires and all that kind of stuff. And we also see that that cable bundle is made in China. Behind those cables, in the cable management area, just behind that, we see that there is the chassis identifier, which shows us that the chassis is made in China. Behind the storage backplane and inside the cables we just showed is actually a fan partition. We can see that the AVC fans are made in China. The partition itself is a great mechanism. It can be quickly removed. You can actually move the entire partition out without any tools or anything like that. It's just 2 latches. Great design. This partition or fan cage is also made in China. The fans push air through an air baffle system that directs air over the CPU heat sinks and to the correct portions of the chassis. This air baffle system is made in China. That air baffle directs air through the CPU heat sinks, and those heat sinks, at least the one that we have, is made in China. That heatsink cools the Intel Xeon Bronze 3204 CPU, and we didn't see a country of origin stamped on the CPU itself. We checked our review chip that we used in 2019, and that didn't have a country of origin listed on it either, so that is what it is. Next to the CPU is the DRAM. In our system, we only had a single 8GB Samsung DDR4 DIMM, and this is made in South Korea. The motherboard has 2 labels. The first is next to the dual internal USB 3.0 Type A connectors and the PSU receptacle, and this says that it's a product of China. The second one, printed on the motherboard itself, actually says product of China as well. Now our system only had a single riser installed, and here we see a similar label and PCB print that both say product of China. It's very similar to what we saw on the motherboard. The rear of the riser has a second M.2 drive slot and another sticker that says made in China. Overall, these risers are actually a great design. We have 2 M.2 slots. We also have 3 PCIe slots on here. The one thing that we would like to see, a small little bit that HPE could do a little differently, is change the M.2 slots from, kind of screw down M.2 drives to having some kind of toolless mechanism to keep the drives in place. That would be cool. But this is actually just a really awesome riser as far as risers go. And yeah, we review a lot of servers, so we do nerd out on things like this. Under the PCIe riser, we have the HPE FlexLOM slot. We use a lot of FlexLOM modules at STH in our lab servers, and this particular card is a Cavium, which is now Marvell-based, 10 gig or 25 gig Ethernet adapter. It is labeled made in Malaysia. And something we just want to quickly note here is you can see how this connector is actually perpendicular to the rear of the chassis, which means that you have to uninstall the riser and then get in to go do the FlexLOM installation and uninstallation. It's actually something that is going to change in the next generation of servers when we have the OCP NIC 3.0 NICs. I think that is a big change because you can service them directly by pulling the LOMs out of the back of the system. And so it just makes it a little bit easier to service, and they're also faster. So that's something to look out for as we look forward into the new year. On the motherboard itself, we see something interesting. Like the HPE ProLiant DL380 Gen10's mid-cycle change that we covered, we do not see quad 1GB NICs populated. We're not entirely sure why HPE made this change, but there's a common rumor that Broadcom got designed in, and it is interesting that there are pads here for those components, and they were in the original generations of servers, and now they're not there. We just want to show some of the chips here. We see the ILO controller, a Marvell chip with the TW on them. We can also see an SK Hynix DRAM chip for the ILO controller because you need to have memory for your BMCs. There's also a Lattice FPGA, and that is marked Malaysia. Although FPGAs are making waves today for networking, AI, and other areas, and servers like this, they're also used for sensors and making just things like lights blink. If you have a server, you likely have an FPGA in your server, even if you don't see one in your PCIe slots. The power supply is a nice 800 watt 80 plus platinum unit. This is a power supply that can go from 100 to 240 volts, which is important since a lot of the US has 110 or 120 volt power, not necessarily in data centers, but definitely, at the edge locations and just in kind of normal homes and businesses. There were some HP or HPE PSUs that didn't go that low in terms of voltage. And so it's just kind of nice that this is a full range power supply. This power supply is marked made in China as well. Overall, looking inside the server, it seems like the vast majority of these components are made in Asia, which makes sense because that's where most of the electronics manufacturing industry is based, and these just kind of seem like ProLiant products. There are a couple other parts of the server we're not taking pictures and showing off the labels, but those are really kind of the rear, just kind of IO blank slots that because we don't have the extra risers there. Those say made in China as well, but those were a little bit hard to take pictures of, so we're just going to say it and move on. Now, you're not going to install the box and the foam that comes in it into your racks, of course, but we did want to take a look at some of the things that came in the box. And one thing that we got was the rails, and those rails were made in China, just like normal HPE rails. We're not going to have a picture of it, but the power cable also was made in China. You know what a power cable looks like. We did, however, find a key component that was made in the United States, and specifically the ILO license packet was printed in the United States. This may not seem like a big deal, but a lot of the higher end ILO security features also require higher end ILO additions, and so just something to keep in mind. Overall, this looks like a pretty standard HPE ProLiant DL380 Gen10. It just has the T for the trusted supply chain. Again, for anybody that's wondering why are we not doing our full review, it's really just that this is basically a pretty low-end configuration. I mean, this is barely not a bare bones configuration. We just want to note that this is how HPE sent us the server to take a look at the Trusted Supply Chain program. So we didn't get to make any modifications to it. We didn't make any modifications to what HPE sent us. And of course, if you configure your system different than what we have here, you may have different components. After our first article in October 2020, we had some readers suggest that we were wrong in reporting that the components were not going to be all made in the US. Now, I had talked to HPE, so I knew this wasn't going to be the case, but I didn't necessarily know what the mix of US components to non-US components was going to be. Through our teardown of the system, really the only things that we saw that were labeled as made in the US were really the actual system label that's on the front of the system, and then also the ILO packet said that it was printed in the United States. A lot of folks are going to see that and be like, well, wait, why does this have that label? We just have to remember that we only require that we have a substantial transformation and going from components to a server. I guess it is that substantial transformation into this product offering, and that is what gives it that label. It's not that all the individual components are actually made in the US. I can't wait to see the comments on that one. But at the same time, the people that define what is, origin US, made in the US, all those types of things, what qualifies for those different designations, those people are the same people that are running the big bid processes to go and figure out, are they going to go purchase these kind of servers? And so just because it is such a, often used and well-known industry term, I really don't have any issue with the fact that, most of the components are not made in the US, but the system undergoes like a substantial transformation, and so it is considered, origin USA. At the same time, tearing down the system really kind of brings into focus how HPE, I would imagine HPE is going to scale this, because if you're not making components and all these individual cards, like the FlexLOM cards, you're not having to make those in the US and have someone, put components on a PCB in the US and all that kind of stuff. It actually makes it a lot easier to bring this model to different countries outside of the US. What you really just need is you need a manufacturing facility in that jurisdiction where you can go, you can have the components brought in, you can have the substantial transformation or whatever it needs to happen in that jurisdiction. HPE can then, at the end of the manufacturing process, make sure that all the components, but then the system as a whole meets its requirements and specifications. HPE can then lock the configuration and send the server through a secure supply chain to wherever it's going to go. In no way do I think that this is the absolute perfect solution to the problem. And I don't want anybody to get the idea that I think this is absolutely like the only way to go do this or the absolute best way to go do this. There are obviously going to be iterations on this basic principle. At the same time, I do really like the fact that HPE does have an offering like this and is thinking about more than just the physical box and is really thinking about, well, how does the box get from the manufacturing facility all the way to a customer? As an industry, I think we do need to start thinking about that. And I'd love to hear how you're thinking about this physical security in your supply chain in the comments. I do think at the low single digits, just for the box of a price increase for this type of offering, I can kind of understand why that is because, labor in Wisconsin may be more expensive. And I will just note that I do believe that the high touch delivery services and all those kind of like supply chain logistics with certain folks and what have you, those are all kind of, additional adders and additional services that you would add on. They're not necessarily the same as if I just sent something via FedEx. That completely makes sense. Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed this look at this HPE ProLiant DL380T Gen10 and the HPE Trusted Supply Chain. If you did, why don't you drop us a like, click subscribe, turn on those notifications so you can see whenever we come out with great new content. As always, thanks for watching and have an awesome day.